comes a new challenger!
What's going on, everyone? Collin with Challenger TCG here, bringing you another deck profile, this time on Draven, Glorious Executioner. As people are probably aware by now, this deck has been an absolute menace in the metagame and is taking Set 2 by storm, boasting wins in the most recent China event, as well as some notable online events and the first proxy event in Bologna. This deck has been winning pretty much everything, and I'm here to break down exactly why that is and why you should be playing Draven. Before getting into the deck lists, I do want to let everyone know that we will have a Metafy guide linked in the description below for anyone who's interested in a more in-depth look into both lists, as well as important interactions, why each card is played. So definitely check out our Metafy if you haven't already, down in the description below. Starting us off, I want to cover that we'll be going into both variations of Draven, both the classic variation and the miracle version that won the recent Bologna event. Either way, you'll be playing the same legend, which is Draven Glorious Executioner, which is far and away the best legend that they've ever printed, and hopefully will ever print, as this card is insanely good. What he simply reads is just when you win a combat, draw one. This means that anytime that you have a unit stick around a battlefield and your opponent does not, and they sent a unit in to initiate that combat, or you sent it in yourself, you'll draw a card. So cards such as Fight or Flight, Rebuke, Void Seeker, be anything else that removes your opponent's unit from battle, or even just winning the combat outright by having more might than your opponent. Each and every time that that combat is initiated, you'll draw a card. Additionally, if it's on your turn and you just send in a unit, you run over your opponent's unit, then not only are you killing their unit and scoring a point, but you're also drawing a card doing that. So this engine will often draw you anywhere from 5 to 10 cards over the course of a game, and is absolutely absurd compared to any other legend that exists right now. Getting into the battlefields, we have our Game 1 battlefield, in my opinion, should always be Reaver's Row. This is just your most powerful battlefield, and as we know, winning Game 1 can be very, very impactful, as you were guaranteed to go first in games 2 or 3, so having that guaranteed going first game, as well as wanting to 2-0 your opponents for a tiebreaker's sake, is very important. So that's why we always start with our most powerful battlefield. Reaver's Row just simply states when you defend here, you may move a friendly unit here to base. This is something that we saw previously out of the Kaiser deck as a way to protect the Kaiser, but now we're using in Draven to abuse our legend ability, as the way that this interacts is that anytime that you send a unit into the Reaver's Row, if your opponent decides to retreat out, sure, you don't kill the unit, but as I previously mentioned, if your unit ever sticks around in combat and your opponent does not, then you win the combat, so it works the same for this, and that is declared a win for Draven in combat. So you score the points, you get to draw your card, and then if your opponent sends a unit in to do the same thing, then you get to save your own unit, and they do not get to draw a card unless they're Draven themselves. So this interaction alone is what makes this deck so oppressive, and is something that will be a mainstay of this deck pretty much no matter what. Going into our games 2 and 3 battlefield, games 2 and 3, whichever one you have the choice, should be Targon's Peak, in my opinion. This just synergizes with the deck very, very well, in that, as you'll see as we get into it, it's all about 2-cost interaction spells, and Targon's Peak being one such that you can conquer it, and then as soon as you do, you have that 2 energy available on your opponent's turn to cast any of a plethora of spells. Is very, very strong. The only thing I will mention about this is that when you conquer Targon's Peak, unless they run over your unit, then obviously you'll hold it and you won't be able to conquer it next turn. So make sure that the turns that you're actually conquering this battlefield are one that you actually want to hold up that 2 energy for something. Otherwise, you should probably conquer your opponent's battlefield instead, and then save the conquer for this one on a future turn. Then our game 2 or 3 battlefield that your opponent gets the choice is currently Treasure Hoard. This is one that you can kind of debate, but for the general purposes, I'm going to recommend Treasure Hoard until you know exactly what the metagame is that you're going into. The alternative, which I'll go ahead and talk about right now, is Obelisk of Power, as a solid alternate if you want to, specifically for, I think, the Draven Mirror. It might have some relevance there in that it will allow you to play your chosen champion on turn 1 going second, which is very strong and kind of helps with the play draw disparity. However, it is significantly worse into pretty much every other deck in the format. So until you know exactly what you're going to be playing into, I would say Treasure Hoard is a lot better as a generic battlefield. So it's what I'll recommend here. And it simply just states whenever you conquer here, you can pay 1 to make a gold gear token exhausted. The power of this is that when you're going second, all of your plays out of the Draven deck are on even increments. So 2 costs, you don't have any 3 costs in your deck. All of your 4 costs, you're going to be playing your chosen champion on turn 2 anyway. So you'll have that 1 energy there in order to generate a gold here, which then can pay for your power later on and just make things a lot easier for you, as this is a very power hungry deck. It's typically not as common for you to make a gold past turn 2, but you will often make one on that turn 2 after you send in your first played unit and then play your chosen champion. For that reason, I think it's worth its inclusion as a game 2/3 battlefield going second, but Obelisk is a viable alternative as well, so definitely keep that in mind. Getting into our deck list, we have Draven Vanquisher, which is a 4-cost 4-might, which is already pretty good on rate. That has 2 lines of text, so you know that it's good. Who simply states, when I win a combat, I play a gold gear token exhausted. So this will be the same timing window as your legend, where if you do this with Draven Vanquisher, now you're going to be not only drawing a card, but also generating a gold token to pay for the power of all these things. And then he also states, when I attack or defend, you can pay a Fury rune. If you do, give me +2 might this turn. This will be a trigger very similar to Reaver's Row, where as soon as combat is initiated, this will go on the stack, and then once that trigger resolves, you can determine whether or not you would like to pay for it. Notably, with Reaver's Row, if you attack in with this unit first, then your opponent will have to resolve Reaver's Row and retreat out before you have to even pay the energy on this to get the boost, which is a quite nice interaction and is very synergistic. Outside of that, this should always be your turn 2 play. There's pretty much no reason to do anything other than this outside of maybe like a 2-drop plus Noxious Hopeful, but just getting this guy online so they can start generating you gold as soon as possible is typically going to be my recommendation. Blood Rush here is our first spell that we're going to cover as a updated cleave from set 1. This is just kind of an alternative that I particularly like out of the Draven deck just because of the versatility of it. Our deck is already built in such a way that we want to be operating on even cost energy anyways, so that repeat allowing you to play this a second time is pretty nice. You can also spread the Assault 2 that this gives to multiple units, which can allow you to break into different battlefields at the same time. So, in my personal opinion, I think this card is much better than Cleave from set 1 as the obvious comparison, but they are very, very similar, so I could see it one way or another. If for some reason you need to hit a specific might breakpoint in a specific matchup, then maybe Blood Rush would be worse than Cleave in those situations, but in most, I would just say play Blood Rush. You definitely will not regret it. This card is great. Notably, there is a misprint on the card similar to set 1 that had some issues. The Assault is only until end of turn, so it does not give a unit Assault 2 permanently, unfortunately, but despite that, it is still a very, very good card. After that, we have Stack Deck. As previously mentioned, this deck does operate on even energy a lot of the time, and Stack Deck is kind of your filler card to be able to spend that 1 extra energy when you're going second. Then it lets you still play something, still be a little bit efficient, find your important cards, especially once you get into the post-board games. Finding some of your sideboard cards can be very, very impactful. So it's just a all-around fantastic card, one that I'm honestly surprised this game ever printed, just because of how powerful and efficient it is to not only be looking at cards efficiently, but it also counts as playing a spell, which can sometimes trigger some of the other cards in our deck, as we'll get into. After that will be Spinning Axe, Draven's chosen signature gear. This is equipment that says Quick Draw, which just means that as reaction, you can equip it for a power of any color, and it has temporary. But notably with temporary on this card, It is different than our traditional temporary in that it will stick around so long as it is equipped to something. So if this is played onto a unit, you can immediately attach it with the quick draw effect. That will permanently be attached to it for as long as it sticks around, and then so long as that unit doesn't die on your opponent's turn, then the axe will stick around for you to be able to pay the equip cost onto other things. This card is insane. Again, we're going into why this deck is so powerful. We have the strongest legend, one of the strongest chosen champions, and certainly one of the strongest signature gears or spells in this case that currently exists in the game. So being able to have access to all these things in one deck that's also in a very powerful color combination, you can understand exactly why this deck is as powerful as it is. This card just lets you win combat whenever you want. If your opponent decides to try and Falling Star your Draven Vanquisher and you have 2 energy up, then surprise, you can play an axe. Now your guy's a 7 might, it survives the Falling Star, it survives the Singularity, all these sorts of things. This card just has so much versatility and is something that you will use quite often. Notably with equipment, there is the ability to use it multiple times in a turn. If it's on your turn, you can equip this to a small unit, send it in, trade for as much as you can. So say that you have a 2-drop, you equip this. Now your guy is a 5 might unit. You send it to a battlefield, you kill 5 mites worth of units. This equipment will stay around because temporary will only be lost at the start of the turn. And then you can equip it on to something else, send it into that battlefield, and keep doing this, rinse and repeat, and until your opponent's board is completely cleared. So just having access to equipment is very, very powerful for that effect, and the fact that this can work as a defense piece as well as an offense piece makes this card quite good. After that, we'll have Spinning Axe's little brother in Longsword. This card, as you can see, pretty much reads the exact same thing as a 2 energy, 1 power, quick draw equip that only gives +2 might instead of +3. To be honest, Spinning Axe is just such a powerful card that having additional copies that will stick around permanently even if your unit dies is quite nice. Just being able to get that extra +2 might to break into a battlefield is sometimes all that you need, and this card does that perfectly well. So while definitely not as strong as Spinning Axe, and if I ever have both in my hand I'll typically mulligan the Longsword, it is still such a powerful effect that having it in multiple copies is not bad at all. After that, we'll get into our interaction suite. Starting off with Hard Bargain. This is our newest counterspell that was given to Chaos in this color, which is reaction and has repeat, meaning that you can pay its 2 energy cost an additional time to cast it a second time, and it says counter a spell unless its controller pays 2. This is kind of similar to Spell Pierce out of Magic, if you've ever played that game, as a situational counterspell, in that it will work much better into things such as Time Warp or Singularity, Acathian Rain, all these cards out of Kaiser that typically give us a headache, now can just be answered for 2 energy. And, you know, if they hold up more than 2 energy in order to play their spell, then you can repeat it, and it's not a problem. In a card such as Time Warp, that will always cost them 10 energy, so at most they can have as 2 up. So with the repeat, this card can always counter Time Warp, which is normally a pretty annoying card, but not something that we have to worry about quite as much so long as we have access to the Hard Bargain. Also out of decks such as the Victor Control deck, it can stop their combo, the Imperial Decree plus Bella's Breath, as typically they play on pretty low energy and resources, so this card will typically win you the game so long as you have it. After that, we have 1 copy of Switcheroo. This deck sees so many cards that I'm a big fan of playing one-ofs, so while normally some people don't like playing one-ofs because of inconsistencies, when you're drawing as many cards as this deck, as well as playing stack deck, and all these sorts of things, just having access to these various different spells that makes your opponent have to play around them is always very, very nice. And this card is very, very strong as a hidden. You can hide it for a power to play it to a battlefield and swap 2 mites of units at the same battlefield. So you can neg your opponents down to like a 1 or 2 might, and if they were like say a 10 might, then now you have a 10 might, they have a 1 might. There's no way that they're going to win combat after something like that. This is just the most powerful swing that you can have in any single card, so I like having it around just for that reason. Additionally, it just adds to the hitting counters of what your opponent has to play around should they know your deck list. Knowing that you have access to that one switcheroo just means that whenever you hide a card, now this is something they have to think about too. So this is a card I would always play at least one of, and depending upon the meta, you could play more. So definitely keep this card in mind. We also play 2 copies of Falling Star. If you've played this game up until this point, you know exactly how powerful this card is, and it still continues to be that way even post errata, now that they've changed how reflexive triggers work. This is just the most universal removal spell to be able to kill anything that you want, and while the power cost can be a little bit of a drawback in most decks, this deck has a few ways to get around that, being the Draven Vanquisher that you've already seen, or Treasure Hoard that you've already seen. Those are ways that you can reduce this power cost and make it not quite as much of an issue. And then once you do cast it, being able to kill 2 key units or 1 big unit just for 2 energy is very, very strong. And additionally, the way this deck operates is once you've built your board, you don't really care as much about your resources. All that you need is to win the game, and so paying that power cost is not as big of an issue out of this deck. So you'll see a lot more power hungry cards out of this, because our general game plan is to just kind of build the board and then ride our spells that are very, very efficient to victory until your opponent no longer can do anything about it, and you run them out of resources until you eventually score to 8. Our next interaction spell, I'm going to skip ahead on the deck sheet here, is Fight or Flight. This is another mainstay out of set 1 that will pretty much be at max copies in most purple decks forever. This card is just so universal that it's insane that they printed a card like this. For 2 cost energy, it just moves a unit from a battlefield to its base. This does pretty much everything. It can either hit your opponent's unit, it can move your own unit to save it if they're going to get ran over by like a large board that you normally wouldn't be able to push back. You can also hide this card, which would allow you to protect your unit from spells that hit specifically at a battlefield like Hidden Blade or Rebuke. In response, you could flip this up from Hidden to send that unit back to the base, and now their Rebuke or Hidden Blade will get countered because it no longer sees something at a battlefield. Outside of that, it can also be used to functionally give your unit ganking. So long as it's ready to a battlefield, you can play this, send it home, and now you have a readied unit in base that you can just gank over to the other battlefield. So this card is just so universal, and when you're using it for its normal thing of just sending your opponent's unit home, then you also now get to draw a card because you're going to win that combat, which is crazy that you can play this card as a cantrip now, just given her legend ability. Lastly, we have Rebuke. As previously mentioned, power is not as big of a concern in this deck, just because you're going to be playing these cards later in the game, so just having the most powerful spells available is what you're really looking for out of this deck and strategy in particular. So having a couple copies of Rebuke is never bad. It simply just reads at action speed, return a unit at a battlefield to its owner's hand. This is just the best removal spell that currently exists, being able to do it at action speed, and just universally, it doesn't matter what it is, it's sent back to your opponent's hand. They're going to have to spend all their energy to play it again and wait an entire turn cycle before they can even use it. This card can often be time warp if your opponent is, playing like a Ferris Forerunner, which is a new powerful card that is also in this deck and we'll get to. But being able to just play a Rebuke universally on that, or even a Draven Vanquisher, typically that's enough to set your opponent back quite a bit that it's worth the cost. And it's also just your get out of jail free card if something bad ever happens. So having access to a Rebuke in your hand honestly makes you feel invincible a lot of the time, just because you know that there's nothing your opponent can do. Even if they have Deflect, it doesn't matter. Pay the additional power. You're going to set them so far behind, you're going to score a couple of extra points, and it will completely be impossible for your opponent to catch up. Getting into our 2-cost units, we have Overzealous Fan. This is the newest 2-cost 2-might that we'll have that is specifically seemed to be made for Draven, as it just says, when I defend, You can kill it to move an attacking unit to its base. So this is essentially just copies of Fight or Flight 4 through 6 that can also score us points early, which is quite good. It's exactly what we're looking for out of a deck like this. The only thing to note with this is that you do need an additional unit to be on the battlefield with the fan there if you want to draw a card, as if he kills himself to send something back, then you obviously won't win that combat as you don't have a unit in that battlefield. So do keep that in mind. Other than that, it will only use its cost of killing it once the trigger resolves. So that is something to note, that you don't have to kill it beforehand and then your opponent will have some time to interact or something like that. As soon as you kill it, you'll be good. But it also gives them a timing window where the trigger doesn't stack, where they could play something like a Cannon Barrage, as something that we saw out of the Chinese event. Next up is my personal pick for the best 2-cost unit that exists in the game right now is Treasure Hunter. This is just a 2-cost 1-might unit that says, when I move, play a gold gear token exhausted. This card is absolutely insane. I do not know why they printed this one, but for us Draven players, I'm very, very glad that they did. What this just means is that you move to a battlefield, you get a gold token. If your opponent decides to send a unit into it and kill it, then we have a Draven Vanquisher that's in the base that's going to immediately run back over that. It's going to draw us a card. We're going to get a second gold and just continue to be off the races. Now we've got 2 gold to play our Falling Star or Rebuke for free. You thought Kaiser playing a Falling Star for no power was a problem. Well, now we've got Draven that's playing Falling Star for no power as opposed to Kaiser's 1 power. So other than that, it also synergizes extremely well with Reaver's Row, where because it's a move that happens from the Reaver's Row, if you send this unit in there and then they try to run over it, well, now your Treasure Hunter is going to move back. It will give you a second gold because it was considered a move. Your Treasure Hunter is perfectly safe, and now it can send into the other battlefield for 3rd gold, or you can even send it right back into the Reaver's Row and your opponent will have to retreat out. Otherwise, they can lose to a card like Switcheroo that we can now play for just the 2 energy cost because we've already generated the 2 gold to play that for free and kill whatever unit it is, or, Spinning Axe, Longsword, all these sorts of things that threaten it. So this card on Reaver's Row is probably the most oppressive interaction that exists in the game right now, so we're definitely going to be abusing it as much as we can because, honestly, it just feels unstoppable. All of your power costs are pretty much paid for the rest of the game, and it just lets you do whatever you want. Lastly, we have Tide Turner as another 2-cost unit. It has Hidden that allows you to kind of bluff it or use it later in the game to have some very, very tricky plays whenever you're trying to hold for the last point. And it just says, when you play me, you can choose the unit you control at another location and move me to its location and it to its original location. So you can pretty much just swap them around. This can allow you to do some surprise defender shenanigans, including with Overzealous Fan. If you were to flip this up from Hidden and then put the Overzealous Fan into the battlefield and the Tide Turner wherever the fan was, that would actually consider the Overzealous Fan as defending now, and you could then trigger its effect to push out your opponent's unit kind of out of nowhere, essentially creating it as a hidden fight or flight. You can also just do that to have surprise defenders so that you put a much bigger unit in there, maybe something that was equipped with a Spinning Axe that your opponent was not expecting to have to deal with. And outside of that, it's just a 2-cost 2-might unit, so playing it on turn 1 is never bad to be able to score points and kind of get things rolling, where you send into a battlefield, then your opponent can maybe run it over, but if they do, you'll always have a Draven Vanquisher sitting in the battlefield because that will always be your turn 2 play. And from there, you can just kind of draw your card, you can generate your gold, really start the snowball going. For our other theoretically 2-cost unit, we have Noxious Hopeful here. This is just a powerhouse from set 1 as a functional 2-cost 4-might. It just says Legion, it costs 2 less if you've played another card this turn, and that is quite good when we're still in a field of Falling Stars, because not only is Kaiser playing Falling Star, but Draven is now too, so 4-might is kind of the perfect break point that you're looking for, and being able to build a board for so cheap and have it be so efficient is just crazy. So I think this is a card that will always be included in standard Draven variations in my mind. I know this is one that you won't see in every list, but is one that I personally think that every list should include, just because of how powerful it is to have this 4 might unit that you can discount with cards like Stack Deck, you can discount it with another 2-drop, whatever it may be. Getting this into play is never an issue. Going off our lone 3-cost unit, we have Fizz, which, while technically a 3-cost unit, is one that you'll never be playing on turn 1, so it definitely feels more expensive than that. But when you're on your final turn, you can play it to flash back a Rebuke or Falling Star, whatever thing that you want to play from your graveyard that costs 3 or less, which will be all of our spells. You can even play a Blood Rush from your graveyard and then pay the repeat cost to get a little bit extra might onto some units if that's what you need. Whatever it is, Fizz has got you, and that's why he's worth the inclusion as a 1-of. Notably, you can only play these during before combat, so that's why I don't think he's worth including as more than 1 currently. But if it ever gets to a point where you just want to cast nothing but Fighter Flights or Rebukes to score that last point, Fizz is a great way to do that, because it also leaves the body around and lets you get that 3rd copy of Rebuke, 3rd copy of Falling Star, 4th copy of Fighter Flight, and all in 1 card, while also giving you a 3-might body, which is quite good. After that, we have a lone copy of Kaiser Survivor. This is a mainstay of set 1, and simply is just a 4-cost 4-might with Accelerate that says when I conquer, draw 1. The reason she is in here is sometimes you just need more Accelerate units, and she is the best one that also provides you repeated card advantage when your opponent decides to not initiate combat with you. Even if they do that, then Kai'Sa will still draw cards on Conquer. She works particularly well with the Reaver's Row, and is just an all-around fantastic card that for only 5 energy can accelerate wherever you need her. So I like having the 1 copy as just kind of a surprise factor. When you need an accelerate unit that is not Darius, it really provides, and not much more to say other than that. It's just a good card all around, and I'm never sad to have a Kai'Sa Survivor in my deck. Speaking of which, we have Darius Trifarian as another powerhouse from set 1. This card is a 5/5 that says when you play your 2nd card in a turn, give me +2 and ready him. This means that you can use him to accelerate himself into a battlefield. You can use him if he's already been in your base for a turn. You can send him into a battlefield, win that combat, play a 2nd card, ready him, and then send him home, allowing you to safely break battlefields, draw cards off of your legend, and then this guy will stick around in your base and just be a nuisance that your opponent has to deal with every single turn. And they can't even kill it in combat because he's just so sticky by not sticking to a base if you want him to. Outside of that, the Accelerate is honestly something I try to avoid as much as possible. I think Darius's true strength lies in just being able to break battlefields every single turn. So I try to play him as early as possible so that I can later do the ready shenanigans of sending him into a battlefield, winning the combat, and then readying him to send it back home. But it is kind of a matchup dependent thing, so you'll have to feel out the matchup and see which variation of Darius you like. Either way, though, you can't go wrong with a 7-might accelerator for only 5 energy, or something that is as sticky as Darius is. Next up is our newest unit to Fury, Ferris Forerunner, which is a 6/6 and a power that states Death Knell, play 2 3-mech unit tokens to your base. Honestly, it can look not super intimidating at first, or you can't quite understand why this card is as powerful as it is. And honestly, going into the set, I didn't realize how strong this card would be, but once you play with it, you'll realize just how crazy this card is. If your opponent decides to break it in combat, not only do they have to commit a bunch of resources to it, because our deck is built to protect our units very well with all of the previously mentioned spells and equipment, but it also will give you 2 different 3-might units in base, which you can now use to break into both battlefields after they've killed this, because again, we have so many good equipment, we have all these spells, just having 2 separate bodies that can break into both battlefields is absolutely insane. This card would be a mainstay 3 of, but it does have issues with Rebuke, as previously mentioned, is one of its kind of biggest weaknesses right now. So I think it's only really worth running 2 in the main deck, but we do have a 3rd copy, as I'll get into, out of the sideboard for pretty much any deck that is not running Rebuke. You'll want the 3rd copy of this. Lastly, we have Brynhir Thundersong, a set 1 card that we all kind of laughed at for the longest time, just because the game was not really built in such a way that stopping your opponent from holding was ever a problem. But now that we are to that point, and we have decks like this one that are playing all these Fight or Flights and Rebukes, Switcheroos, hidden cards, so on and so forth, you can just play this card and completely shut it all down. Once you're at 6 points and you've built up a base with all of our efficient units like our Noxious Hopefuls, our Darius, so on and so forth, sitting in base, then you can just play this guy and completely shut your opponent out of the game. It'll allow you to do perfect combat math because you know your opponent can't play a single card to interrupt it in any way, shape, or form. So it essentially just gives you perfect information right then and there and won't allow them to do pretty much anything. And if you're playing into a deck such as Aurelia, they spend all their buff spells in response to this trigger, then you can just rebuke it right back. It's absolutely oppressive for decks like that to try and deal with this. So for that reason, I think it's worth the 2 inclusions in the main deck. It is bad into decks such as Kaiser that don't really use spells, but into the 2 biggest meta threats being Aurelia and Draven right now, this card is amazing, so I think it's worth including in the main deck. And speaking of which, that will cover our main deck. Getting to our sideboard, we do have a couple of additional copies of some of the cards in our main deck, so I won't really cover those, being Ferris Forerunner, Brynhir, and Hard Bargain. Essentially, you want Hard Bargain into like Victor Control plus Kai'Sa, you want Forerunner into anything without Rebuke, and you want Brynhir into anything with Rebuke. So it's kind of lets you mix and match your top end when you have these in your sideboard into whichever matchup is better. And again, our strategy is just so powerful that we just want to be as consistent as possible. So seeing additional copies, especially of the Brynhir, allows you to, similar to like the Via the Wind combo out of Annie earlier, where you'd go from 4 to 6 and then 6 to 8. You can kind of do the same here with Brynhir if you have multiple copies of that, where you're on 4 points, you play the Brynhir, you score to 6, and then next turn, they can't do much, and then you play, but they think they'll be able to hold up all their energy to play these spells, and then you play a second Brynhir, and then it's just lights out. Outside of that, for actual unique cards that we have in our sideboard, we have Assembly Rig. This is a 4-cost gear that says pay 1 and a power and recycle a unit from your trash to play a 3-might mech unit to your base. This is the card that will probably come in and out depending upon the meta, but the Victor Control deck was the 4th most popular deck at the most recent China event, and this card is very, very good into that as just a way to provide you endless bodies. One of the few issues this deck really has is if your opponent runs you out of units. Your deck is entirely built around winning combat and surviving combat in order to draw cards off of your legend, so losing out on units, your deck just doesn't do anything, so this provides you an endless stream of units into those hard control decks. So if you're expecting those, I think this is one of the best options for it. Otherwise, this card can definitely be substituted out for anything else that you think it would do. As for one card that I don't think really can be substituted out just because of how powerful it is Thermo Beam. We have 2 copies here in the sideboard as a kind of catch-all for any sort of gear deck. It simply is just a 5 energy and 2 power for kill all gear, notably at action speed, so you can do a lot of cool things with this. For example, if you're playing against like a Orin deck and they hide a Zhonya's Hourglass and you get enough might to run over that Orin, then you don't even have to play this card until they flip the Zhonya's Hourglass to try and protect their Orin, or similar out of Yi. All these sorts of decks that are somewhat gear reliant now with the inclusion of all the equipments and such, you can play this at action speed in order to really get your opponent kind of out of nowhere. Outside of that, all these equipment decks will hold this card. Decks such as Azir, Ornn, even Aurelia has a lot of gear-based variations that are very reliant on all of her Guardian Angels and Zhonya's, as previously mentioned, in order to protect her. as well as the Boots of Swiftness. Pretty much all those cards out of Aurelia you'll want Thermo Beam for. So that will cover the specifics into the classic Draven that I personally recommended. Hopefully you'll have a couple of ideas as to things that you may want to change around here or there. This is definitely by no means the only version of this that you should play, but I think if you're looking to play Draven in some way, shape, or form, you should start with this list and then kind of tweak it based on the metagame that you expect. And this is something that we will definitely be updating as time goes on as well. Now, getting into our second deck list here, this is one that was piloted by a friend of the channel, Dickel, to win the 300-man Bologna event. That was done with proxies approximately 2 weeks ago. If y'all have been paying attention to tournament results, then you've definitely seen this deck list, as many people have. And the question I've gotten the most is, why play this list over Classic Draven? And honestly, in my opinion, they both have their pros and cons, but it really just comes down to personal preference. If you want specifics, I believe that the Classic Draven is a little bit better into the mirror, albeit not by much. This version is much better into some of the off-meta stuff, such as Aurora and other decks that just aren't able to clear boards, Fiora as well. This will perform much better into, but still struggles into the same things that the original Draven does, which is just if they can clear your board out of combat and you run out of units, then this deck will lose just like the original Draven list. So, in my opinion, their matchup spread is so similar that you should just play whichever variation you like the look of more. But yeah, outside of that, it really just comes down to personal preference. I know these decks are very different, but truly from our testing, the percentage points that are gained one way or another are so small that it really does not matter which version that you choose to play on a competitive level. But if you like the look of one over the other, then definitely go for that one instead. So our legend here is the exact same, so I won't really be covering that. Our runes, however, are quite different. We're only on 4 Fury and 8 Chaos runes. This is just because of how this deck is built. You need access to Chaos runes as soon as turn 1 in a lot of situations, and otherwise you do not really need Fury runes that often with the gold that gets generated out of our Chosen Champion as well as Treasure Hunter. So we leave it at 4. Our battlefields, as you can see, are also quite different. We are not running Reaver's Row in this variation for a specific reason, that this deck is a lot more based on being able to kill our opponent's units rather than protecting our own. And Reaver's Row is something that we'll still see out of the classic Dravens, but they use it a lot better than we do. The edge that you get in the mirror is that you're able to kind of play all of your units all at once in this variation. So instead, our neutral battlefield here is Zon Warrens. Zon Warrens is a mainstay from set 1 for any purple deck that wants to discard Scrap Heap, and ours is no different. The only exception is because of new cards from set 2. We will continue to play our Scrap Heaps past game 1, but we'll get into that as we move on. Outside of that, it's a pretty simple battlefield. Every time you conquer, you get to discard and draw. This lets you filter through your entire deck. Whenever your Scrap Heap gets discarded off this, you draw 2 instead, which always feels amazing. And outside of that, it just fills your grave, does everything that you want to, so it's clearly our best battlefield. Our game 1 going first battlefield is the exact same, and for the exact same reasons, so I won't go too in-depth into Targon speak. Just having additional runes is always nice, and this card certainly provides that. Lastly, Minefield is a somewhat weak battlefield that doesn't provide that much, but it does do things for our deck, in that we want to get through our entire deck as quickly as possible, whether it be milled or otherwise, as we have ways to recur things back into our deck if we make it all the way through. So it's a benefit, and then also this will feed into our Rossas and Fizzes, cards like that, in order to make our deck operate as efficiently and smoothly as possible. Whereas for opponents, this will never actually really benefit them. While it's not really a detriment to mill 2 cards, it is something that can be a little bit annoying for your opponents to have to deal with. So anything that's a positive for us and net neutral for our opponents is always going to be considered for battlefield slots. There will be a few cards that are covered, so unless they have differences, these cards will be covered in the previous version, so I won't go too in depth to them. Draven Vanquisher is one of the best chosen champions in the game, and part of the reason why you want to play this strategy in Draven as opposed to other decks is just this guy. Being able to have this consistent turn 2 play is something that Annie and Jinx are not able to do. So outside of the legend ability obviously being insane, this version does not play Spinning Axe, so this is the main reason why we still choose to play Draven out of this. Called Shot is one of the new cards from set 2 that's insane. If you've been playing card games for any amount of time, you should know that free spells are either going to be broken or unplayable, and this card is definitely on the broken side. Being able to just be functionally a look at 4, draw 2 for 0 energy and only 2 power or 1 power when we have our Ezreal out, as we'll get into that later, is insane. This is part of our engine that lets us filter through our entire deck and get to a point sometimes where we can deck out, and that's actually a benefit for the reason that we will see as we get into this deck list a little bit more. Outside of that, try not to play this card early, as the power cost is definitely still a bit of a cost, so you don't need it early. You know what your guaranteed turn 1 is going to be in a 2-cost unit or Ezreal. You know what your turn 2 is going to be, which is a Draven Vanquisher, so at least until turn 3, you have no reason to play this. Seal of Discord is a gear from set 1 that just costs you a power and taps to add a power. This is just something that gives us power for the rest of the game, essentially 1 every turn, and it doesn't cost a power the same turn that you play it, so long as you play it on a turn that you're using that power anyways. It ends up being net neutral, and then every other turn beyond that is +1 power, which is quite nice. It's also a gear that we can play for free, which for some of our cards that we'll get into later, you'll be hearing me say a lot of that, but this is a very synergistic deck, so cards only really work in the context of this deck as a whole, which is why this deck is so different than the traditional Draven. But yeah, this is just a card that is quite good. Kind of like Called Shot, the only turn that you should ever be playing a seal is if you're tapping it in order to play something that costs a power. So on any turn that you would pay for power anyways, then you might as well throw one of these out there, play your thing that costs power, and then now for every turn in the future, you'll have 1 free power to do with as you please. Stack deck is the same as in our traditional deck, but in this deck it does have a little bit more combo potential, in that sometimes I will hold on to stack decks rather than just immediately ripping it off, because it can reduce the cost of our batting rams, as well as look for something a little bit more specific. The later in the game that you can play these cards, typically the better, because you'll have more information as to knowing what it is that you're actually looking for. If you're just playing this on turn 1 and you already have a 2-cost unit, and you have your Draven Vanquisher obviously and Chosen Champion, then you don't necessarily know exactly what it is you're looking for, right? If you already have your combo pieces, then it can sometimes be better to wait to play a card like this, just so you can have a little bit more information as to what it is that you need. Scrap Heap is a card that is a powerhouse from set 1 that we've seen mostly in Annie's, combined with its buddy here, Traveling Merchant, in order to create a very, very strong draw engine. Because this is discarded, you draw 1, it essentially becomes a draw 2 on any sort of Zon Warrens or triggering a Traveling Merchant, whatever it may be. And that is very, very strong. This is how you kind of get ahead on cards without even using Draven's legend ability, as a lot of the times you'll find your opponents not ever wanting to get in combat with you and filter through. This deck doesn't actually care if you get your legend ability triggered or not, because it has so many ways to draw cards. Between all the scrap heaps that you discard, all the call shots that you play, each of those is going to be a +1, meaning that you'll get an additional card over the one that you spent. So that's going to be 6 additional cards that you're seeing just from those 2. And while it may seem like initially you aren't going to be able to see all of them every game, with just these 3 cards as well as the Traveling Merchant and 1 other card in the deck, there are just so many ways to see your entire deck that it becomes very, very easy. So speaking of which, Traveling Merchant, our best turn 1 play in this strategy, just because it does everything we're looking for while also being 2 might, being able to filter through things and sculpt your perfect hand is very, very nice, and this unit does that extremely well. I love this guy. He just makes everything feel so consistent when he's online, and it's just so nice to be able to discard whatever it is that you don't need at the time, fill up that graveyard, and still provide an actual relative body. Vi here is in as a one of. This card is very, very different than something out of Annie that you would traditionally see combined with Ride the Wind. You'll notice that we don't even play Ride the Wind because there isn't really a reason to. That's not what she's in here for. Her ability to recycle one from your trash is kind of her real use here. As previously mentioned, there are ways that you can kind of deck yourself out, and if you have a Vi in play, then once you've gotten rid of your deck, or you've gotten close to it, then anything that you recycle will come back to the top immediately, because if you have no deck, then whatever you recycle, that's the next card that you're drawing. So anything that draws a card at that point just is going to be a functional demonic tutor, where you're going to get anything from your grave, recycle it with Vi, draw it with your draw spell, whether it be a called shot or stack deck or traveling merchant trigger, whatever it may be, and immediately be able to play it. And you can do that as many times as you want once you get to that point. So outside of that, she does combine with Bushwhack to create a sort of Vi the Wind combo, only for one side, however. So if you are in a point where you just need a Vi to clear a point, and you know your opponent doesn't have a Rebuke or a Fight or Flight or something of that nature, then you can go for that. But those are the cards that are the reason why Vi the Wind isn't really played anymore, just because Rebuke is so common that trying to send everything into a Vi and then it just getting rebuked is never going to be fun. Falling Star we have as a one of here, and that will have a lot of one ofs, as you'll see, but because this deck kind of sees its entire deck every single game, at least when it's operating on the level that it should, any sort of one of is something that's going to be very powerful, and especially this card is because we have a couple copies of Fizz, a card that was previously mentioned in the classic Draven, and is going to be a part of this deck as well, just because there are times that all you're looking for is some removal, something to kill something by dealing 3 to it twice, or just killing 2 units, 2 overzealous fans, whatever it may be. This card does it all, and then you can flash it back with Fizz to do it all over again. And yeah, there's just still some decks in this format that can't beat Falling Star. With the reduction of Kaiser that we're seeing as well, I think people are getting a lot greedier. But being able to play one copy of this card and remind everyone how powerful it is never a bad thing. Bushwhack is a really strange card that I don't really know why it was made the way that it was. There's no reason for this to have hidden. There's no reason that you'd want friendly units to enter ready on your opponent's turn. So I think it's just kind of a flavor thing, given the name of it. That being said, this card is still very, very strong for us, as there are going to be turns where we need to play all of our units ready. Not even necessarily just a Vi, although it does work super well with that. But once we get into our top end, between Rasa and Battering Ram, being able to play them immediately ready can be important in certain situations. And often I'll be discarding this card in the early game though, because you always have access to our Fizz Trickster here in the deck list that can play it from grave. So it's more of something that you want access to, but this is always going to be the first card that I discard off of a Traveling Merchant or my Ezreal, with the exception of Scrap Heap, of course. So I do think it's an important inclusion for when you need access to those Accelerate units. Outside of that, don't feel bad if you have to discard it as a one-of, because that's kind of what it's there for. Overzealous Fan is another inclusion that is in here, similar to the classic Draven list. It does pretty much the same thing, with the exception that we actually have the ability to recur it. This can create essentially a fight or flight every single turn, and is yeah, very, very hard for your opponent to deal with. So it's just a good 2-cost, 2 might, and probably the best option outside of the other ones that we need to play. So yeah, love this guy. He's really, really strong. Fight or Flight is in here, again, as previously mentioned, just a universal spell that does absolutely everything, whether it's protect your unit, push your opponent's unit, a little bit of everything. So when it comes to picking a removal suite for this deck, you'll notice that this deck kind of has a core engine with all of these things that takes up almost over 30 cards of this 40 card deck are devoted to the engine of, you know, this Traveling Merchant, Scrap Heap, Called Shot, Seals, Stack Decks, the 2 drops that you have to end up playing anyways, Fizz, Ezreal, Battering Ram, and Rasa. So you only have so much room, which is why we only play 2 Fight or Flight, but 2 Fight or Flight out of this deck is like 3 in any other because we just draw so many cards. So I would love to find room for a 3rd, but there really just isn't, in that you have to play everything else. So yeah, that's why only 2, despite it hurting me every time to do so. One thing that we definitely do not play 2 of though is Treasure Hunter. As previously mentioned, this card is just insane, being able to make a gold early, and then behind it you'll just have your Draven Vanquisher. So if you move in, it doesn't really matter if this unit dies. It's actually beneficial for you sometimes that this guy is a 1 might, because if they run it over with a 2 might unit and this guy was 2 might, then they would trade, which would never trigger your Draven Legend. But because it's a 1 might, they'll win the combat, and then you can come in and run over it with a Draven Vanquisher in order to win that combat, get an additional gold, get your draw, and be off to the races from there. Outside of that, the gold is always nice, just to be able to play all of our power-hungry cards. As free as these called shots are, they do still cost us a single power once we get our engine online, so being able to play that, play our Falling Stars, all that sort of stuff is really nice. We also have 2 Rebukes here. This card, honestly, out of this deck feels sometimes like they have 6 copies in their deck, just because, like I said, you're seeing your whole deck, so seeing 2 Rebukes every single time is never going to be an issue. And then you have the Fizzes here that can play it from your trash without paying its energy costs, but you do still have to pay its power costs, so keep that in mind. It just makes it so that there's always going to be a Rebuke sitting there in order to bounce your opponent's unit if they try to hold or come in with something that's a little bit too big. Then Rebuke's got you covered. There's nothing in the game currently that counters Rebuke outside of like the actual green counter spells such as Wind Wall and Not So Fast, so this card will always make you feel safe as long as it's in your hand. Last Rites is one of our other engine pieces. Between this and Vi, you always kind of want access to one of them in order to prevent yourself from decking out, and you can recycle the other one with the other one. So if you use your Last Rites, use that to recycle your Vi if you had to discard it earlier. If you have your Vi, use that to recycle your Last Rites and then draw back into it. And you can do that in order to always make sure that you're never going to deck out. Beyond that, just being a +2 might equipment can really come up in a lot of matchups, as that additional might really does influence things in certain battles. All it takes is for you to be 1 might over your opponents. And the mirrors, especially if they've got a Rasa and you've got a Rasa with the Last Rites, then you're running over theirs, you're getting your Conqueror effect here, and then they have to send multiple units in to even clear your Rasa, and let alone whatever it is that you revived. Speaking of the revive, this is what I was mentioning with Overzealous Fan, being able to recur that every single turn as a essential fight or flight every single turn, and then now on hold, I'm also going to be able to recur another Overzealous Fan, play it from my trash, or another Rasa, whatever it may be. There's tons of stuff that you want to be able to recur with Last Rites. I would almost consider a second copy in here, but I think I like the 1-in-1 buy split, as, like I said, you'll see this card pretty much every single game anyways. So outside of like accidentally mulliganing it in your opening hand, which is something I wouldn't do out of this card, it really doesn't matter that it's only a 1-of. Fizz already covered a little bit, but out of this deck, you're really using this to either play a Bushwhack or a Buke or a Falling Star typically. It is much stronger in this version, as we're not as concerned with playing cards on our opponent's turn as much as we are on ours, and just locking them out of the game that way. Thanks to Rebuke getting rid of their biggest unit and completely getting rid of any possibility that the opponent had to hold. We'll have so many units scoring every single turn that the Rebukes will just be a problem when you're playing them in 4 or 5 copies. Like, you thought the 3 Rebukes would potentially be bad. No, we've got way more than that. You can also recur this off of Last Rites, play it, play another Rebuke, play another Fight or Flight, play another Falling Star. It's very crazy and very annoying when the engine gets on. Speaking of the engine, Ezreal here is kind of our default go-to engine piece, as a 3-cost 3 might that says when you play me, discard 1 and draw 2. So he's already replacing himself plus the card that you end up discarding just on a baseline while being a 3 might, which is quite good for a deck that's trying to cycle through its entire deck. If you discard a scrap heap, now it becomes a draw 3, which is even crazier. And then he also has the additional text that's optional, additional costs a 1 or a power less. We don't have anything that costs additional 1, but we do have the thing that costs a power less, being the called shot here. So this makes our called shot a 0 and 1 power to repeat it, rather than having to pay 2 power, which would be a little bit of a steeper cost. So I'm always trying to keep an Ezreal in my hand just to make sure that I can get my called shot reduced, and even in the worst case, Ezreal can always discard another Ezreal. So this is a card you're always looking for in this deck to really get the engine flowing. And outside of that, he's just a 3-might unit. Again, recurable with last rights here if you need an additional unit in order to draw you some cards, whatever it may be. Going into our last finishers here, we have 3 Battering Rams and 3 Rossas. Kind of speak about these at the same time as they're played relatively similar. They're just our big might units that we're using to finish the game at reduced costs. The biggest thing to note is that if you're on a turn where you've played a bunch of things, the usual thing that you're going for is like a turn 3, you're going for an Ezreal into a stack deck, into a seal, into a called shot. If you do that, that only costs you 4 energy, and now all your Battering Rams cost you 1. So on the play, you can play 2 of them. Going second, you can play all 3 of them if you have them, and really get a board set up. You always want to be trying to play your Rams before your Rossas. So just remember that, Rams before Rossas, just because they are something that will always cost you energy, whereas Rossa does not have this additional clause that says to a minimum of 1. Battering Ram can never cost you less than 1 energy. Rossa certainly can. So if you can fill in the energy gap for Battering Ram on a turn, then that's always what you're going to want to do. And also Rossa costs you power, which typically in most turns you'll want to be spending power on something else, whether it be Rebuke, Last Rites, Called Shot, Ezreal. You've got tons of things that cost power, so basically whenever you're playing this guy, you're not going to be able to use your seals for it, so something to consider as well. Out of our sideboard, we have a lot of the same things that you've seen from the classic Draven. These cards are just good, so there's no reason not to play them. The additional copy of Falling Star is for those decks that are a little bit too greedy and just folded this card, so you'll know it when you see it. If you play into like an Ari or something like that that's very reliant on having a couple of 2-might units right out, then a Falling Star is never a bad option. Hard Bargain is in here for the same reason. Just as a universal catch-all, going into decks like Kaiser Removal or Victor, having some sort of interaction spell or counter spell to mess with their removal that's trying to remove all of our units is definitely nice. Otherwise, this deck is very reliant on kind of just Battering Ram and Rossa. You'll notice these are our biggest units, and we don't really have much in terms of sizable units outside of these guys. So if they aren't able to carry us through the entire game, then things can be a problem, which is why we need those hard bargains out of the board in order to answer all these various removal spell threats, stuff like Singularity and such. I would almost want to play one in the main deck, but because it's not playable with Fizz, in order to counter anything of relevancy, I think it kind of has to be relegated to the board, unfortunately. Switcheroo is just in here as almost additional copies of Rossa and Battering Ram, at least for one combat, as it will let you send in like your Treasure Hunter into a big unit and play this in order to swap mites, which can be huge might swings. Think about playing this into an Aurelia, where that unit sometimes gets a 12, 15 power at times, and if you just send in your little one and you play the Switcheroo, then they better have the not so fast, otherwise they're losing, because this card cannot even be defied, which is quite nice. So in certain matchups like that, where your opponent's just building one large unit, or even if they have units such as Watcher or something like that, this card will be an absolute lifesaver. So definitely consider bringing this card in that in those matchups. We have one Thermo Beam here on the board as well. I personally don't believe that the gear decks are going to be all too prevalent, just because they kind of already lose to the Draven decks without Thermo Beam, but they especially lose to it with the Thermo Beam. And as I mentioned, one of in this deck is basically like a 2 or 3 of in any other deck, because we just see so much of our deck that you'll see this pretty much every time that you need it. If you're expecting a ton of gear decks for whatever reason, then you can always put in the second one, but I would be surprised if you really needed more than one in the current environment. And lastly, we have Brynir Thundersong as a 6-cost 5 might that will completely lock your opponent out of the game. Decks like Aurelia, decks like Draven are going to have some struggles into this card post board, as it'll just be a way to stop them on the turn. This deck is so good at already building up a massive board. The biggest issue with Bryn here is that he doesn't really give you an additional might for the turn, so your board already has to be there in order to break your opponent's board. Well, what deck is better at doing that than this one that has all these cheap battering rams, all these cheap Rossas? You're just going to be playing these cheap units anyways, so it is obviously worth playing here for both the Aurelia and the Draven matchups, but also has some other additional utility into stuff like Ari and the like. Basically anyone that's trying to hold against you, you just use Bryn here to say no. And that will cover our deck profile on Draven Glorious Executioner in both of its forms. As mentioned, we will have a Metafy guide that is linked in the description for those of you that want a more in-depth look into why this list is built the way that it is, as well as potential alternatives and its place in the metagame and to each and every matchup. We'll try to cover that, as well as upload VODs of all of our testing into this Metafy guide as time goes on. That'll cover everything that I have for you all today. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to smash that like button, subscribe if you have not already, and see you all next time.
Challenger TCG is now powered by TopDeck.gg. TopDeck.gg is the tournament software you want to be using when hosting any tournament. It has instant pairings, a robust mobile app, integrated payments, and an easy-to-use interface, all for just $12 a month. You can get a free 14-day trial right now if you want to try out the software, and use promo code CHALLENGER for an additional month free of charge. If you decide you want to keep the software, use promo code CHALLENGER25 for a 25% discount off your yearly subscription plan.